Hi, I'm Dr. Eleanor Kennedy. I'm the Research Manager with the Diabetes Research and Wellness Foundation, and I'm here in Oxford for the 16th International Congress of the International Pancreas and Islet Cell Transplant Association meeting. And it's a really good opportunity to speak to some of the real experts in the field to talk about their cutting-edge research and new developments in whole pancreas and islet cell transplant technology. Paul, how big a problem is diabetes in the UK and globally?
So diabetes is a big problem both globally and in the United Kingdom. Type 2 diabetes is growing exponentially, but type 1 diabetes is also growing. So yes, it's a big global problem.
Can you explain a little bit about what type 1 diabetes is?
So type 1 diabetes, or sometimes termed insulin-dependent diabetes, is when the insulin-producing cells, or islets of Langerhans, which are the clusters of cells making insulin, have been destroyed by a process of the immune system attacking the patient's own islet cells. And this then causes them to have no production of insulin, and therefore they need replacement of insulin in some form or other.
What is islet cell transplantation?
So islet cell transplantation is a process or a treatment in which the islets which have been destroyed in the process of type 1 diabetes are replaced either by using a donor islet, or in the future we hope to be able to use different sources of islets. But essentially, rather than just giving insulin injections, we're actually replacing the cells that have been destroyed. So islet cell transplantation is a minimally invasive treatment in which we actually replace the islets of Langerhans, which are these little clusters of cells within the pancreas that have been destroyed in type 1 diabetes. So rather than then the patient having insulin injections, we're actually enabling them to have full normal production of the insulin that was no longer being produced after they developed the diabetes. Now this has a huge advantage because not only does it mean that we're not just giving a certain number of injections per day or a pump, we're actually replacing the insulin minute to minute in a response to the sugar levels. And in addition to that, we're also producing the other hormones that are produced, which we think are equally important to really get tight glucose control in the patient. And therefore there's big advantages because essentially we know that the tightness of control of diabetes in type 1 is linked to the prevention of the long-term complications. And so that's why we think it's a much more erudite way of truly reversing diabetes rather than just keeping it at bay.
Can you explain a little bit about what the IPITA conference is and why is it important to people working in the field?
So the IPITA conference is held every 2 years. It's an international group of people working, both clinicians and scientists, in the field of whole pancreas transplantation and also islet transplantation. And the importance is it's a very specialised group of people, but it is essentially where the state-of-art science and also clinical results are presented every 2 years. This is the first time it's been held in the United Kingdom, and it's a truly collaborative group of people. And I think what we're going to be hearing over the next few days is the absolutely best and the latest science and clinical results in this field. And therefore it's a very important meeting, and one which I think has not only furthered the field over the last decade, but we hope will also take us into a whole lot of new avenues in the next 10 years, in the next 10 or 20 years.
What are the hopes and realities of people with type 1 diabetes who are going to undergo an islet cell transplant?
The ultimate aim of islet transplantation is to truly reverse diabetes and for the patient not to require insulin at all. But our expectations also have to be realistic, and at the moment, certainly in the UK, our reason for transplanting patients is once they had developed unawareness of their hypos, a very severe condition which a certain number of patients with type 1 after a certain number of years develop. And clearly that's life-threatening, and by replacing the islets, even if we do not get them off insulin, we can nearly always reverse that really debilitating side effect. The ultimate aim is that then for those people to also come off insulin, and we achieve that at the moment in about 58% of patients in the United Kingdom. Obviously with improvements, and that's improvements in techniques, in the number of cells we're using, and ultimately we aim to try and be able to transplant without the need for anti-rejection medication, then of course we can transplant a whole lot of different people that we're not transplanting now, and we hope the results as well will also be that much better. So there's the ultimate aim, and then the current realistic. And I think it's really important we put the perspective right rather than giving false expectations. But over the last decade, islet transplantation has improved so significantly that we now can offer it to a really big group of patients.
What are the limitations to islet cell transplantation, and how many people are waiting for a procedure?
So in the United Kingdom, we're very fortunate because since 2008, the government has funded islet transplantation as a clinical service for patients with life-threatening hypoglycemic unawareness. And we have 3 centres in the country who extract the islets, and we have 7 centres that transplant the islets in a sort of hub and spoke model. There are still many centres around the world, however, where islet transplantation isn't funded, and in that sense it's still a research modality, even though we know it's very successful. So the ultimate aim would be that all around the world, where there is a significant problem with type 1 diabetes, that it is funded for all patients to be able to receive the islets. Now, we are deliberately just now transplanting patients with severe hypos, and we're not fundamentally transplanting all patients with type 1 with the aim of getting them off insulin. Now, that isn't primarily a funding issue, it's just a realistic expectation of what we can routinely achieve. But the ultimate aim would be for it to be available to many, many more people, and the ultimate aim is that it be available for children. And my role as a paediatric surgeon, I'm a professor of paediatric surgery here in Oxford as well as head of the islet programme, and the reason I got involved in islets in the first place is this whole drive that ultimately we would like to be able to give a patient, a child, an islet transplant soon after they're diagnosed with the condition. We are away from that at the moment, and the biggest obstacle is the fact that if a patient has an islet transplant, they require long-term anti-rejection medication. And although that is very safe, it is not without its potential problems lifelong. If we can remove that obstacle, and that's really huge areas of our research are concentrating on that, then we have a treatment that we can use for many more people and ultimately children.
Could you talk a little bit about xenotransplantation and the potential it has for giving us more cells that are transplantable?
So one of the limitations of islet transplantation is the islet isolation or the extraction process. And that has 2 limitations. The actual process itself is fairly inefficient, but also there's a limitation of the number of human organ donors as there is for any type of transplant. Now, the beauty about islet transplantation being a cell transplant is that we think that in the future we'll be able to use alternative sources of islets without requiring a cadaveric or a heart-beating donor. And there's 2 sources that we're looking at are stem cells and also animal islets, or so-called xenotransplantation. Now, of course, previously we always used to use pig insulin, so it's not very far from where we've been already. But the aim then is that you could potentially have a renewable source of islets, a constant source of islets from an animal product, probably pigs is the most likely. And there's a lot of very good research and lots of very good advances in that area. And it may well be a realistic a treatment in the coming years. So that is the 2 approaches, a stem cell approach or a xenogenetic approach. And teams are working equally hard on both those modalities.
Can you explain a little bit about the DRWF funded islet isolation laboratory here in Oxford, and also how that supports other research in other parts of the country and other parts of the world?
DRWF have been absolutely key in the development of islet transplantation here in Oxford, in the United Kingdom, in a number of centres across Europe and further afield. Their ongoing support is absolutely critical, and we look forward to partnering with them for many years to come.
How long have you lived with type 1 diabetes, Ray?
Right, I've lived with type 1 diabetes for 25 years, which was considerable length of time, so I was in my early 30s when I developed it.
Can you describe your problems with hypo unawareness?
Yeah, my hypo unawareness was probably worse over the last 5 years of having diabetes. It was quite devastating because although it started and it wasn't too bad, it gradually got worse, and it was really to the point where I would be unconscious sometimes over that, and these were happening at various times, so it affected my family life, my social life, my working life, because obviously when somebody is aware and they're talking to you and then the next minute you can be totally unconscious, that was very worrying for both me and for the people that observe that.
How did you hear about the opportunity for an islet cell transplant?
The opportunity for having a islet cell transplant came about through my local consultant. I'd been with him for about 11 years and he'd heard about Professor Johnson's work with islet cell transplants, and he felt that I might be a suitable candidate for the programme, and he'd said that he would write to Professor Johnson to see if it was possible that I could be interviewed to see if there was any possibility of being a suitable candidate, because he felt that it would improve my life considerably. So that was how I had heard about it.
When did you receive your first transplant and how was it carried out?
My first transplant was in February of 2010, and that was done at the Churchill Hospital. I had got a lot of trepidation about whether it would actually achieve the aim of me getting back my hypo and awareness. I was awake during the operation, and so that was a little bit frightening, but nevertheless it did all go very smoothly, and so you know, it certainly wasn't as bad as I'd expected it to be, and so I was looking forward to it with great hope, but certainly some trepidation.
How long did it take for the infusion to start working?
The infusion started working by the second week after I'd actually had the transplant. I didn't have any hypos while I was actually in hospital, so it was difficult to test that, although my insulin requirements were halved by the time at the end of the first week of insulin, so obviously that had been a positive. But in terms of hypo awareness, they were back within the second week of me having the islet cell transplant. So that was a very quick response to obviously the transplant. So I felt very, very positive about the fact that it had achieved or started to achieve what the aims of it were.
What difference did the transplant make to your diabetes control, and did you have to continue to inject insulin?
Right. It made, the transplant made a significant difference to my diabetes control. In terms of insulin, I was still obviously on insulin, but my insulin requirements actually were cut to almost half of the dose that I was actually taking prior to the transplant. And then the other significant difference it made was the fact that by the second week I had got the signs of hypo-awareness that had actually returned prior to the transplant. So that was a very positive, and for me certainly a very hopeful response to the transplant, and obviously gave me some very hard evidence and proof that the transplant was beginning to work. And obviously, in fact, after the transplant, I didn't have any more periods of unconsciousness because the hypo-awareness was so good that it never actually returned that level of going to be unconscious. So it was totally, almost what I would describe as a transformation in terms of my diabetes control. And obviously because I was on significantly lower doses of insulin, it made a difference overall to my diabetes control as well.
Have you had any subsequent infusions?
Yes. I received in October of the same year, so that was in 2010, a second transplant. And the main reason I think for that was that my understanding is that most recipients do have 2, sometimes 3 infusions, and it was felt that it would significantly even further give me more improvement. And so that was carried out in the October of the same year, and subsequently, as a result of that second transfusion, I actually came off insulin within 2 months of that, and have remained insulin free for the last 7 years. So that was an even better than expected result from the transplant.
Are there any side effects of an islet cell transplant?
Yes, there are side effects to the transplant, and these were pointed out to me prior to me receiving the transplant. So they were very, very open and honest at Oxford about some of the side effects that I would experience from this. Mainly, these were to do with taking immune suppression so that the transplant wouldn't reject. And so I was put on immune suppression just prior to the actual infusion taking place, and then after the transplant I've taken immune suppression every day since that. Unfortunately, one of the side effects has been that last year I did develop kidney failure. However, this wasn't only due to the immune suppression, it was due to multifactorial parts of my general health, having had diabetes for 25 years, the immune suppression and one or two other problems. I did develop some gastric problems, and I did develop some haematological problems, but I had visited Oxford on a regular basis. Most of these problems have been addressed and are constantly under review, and I am actually on dialysis for my kidney failure now. But as I said, that was probably the most significant of the side effects of it. But as I said, it wasn't just totally down to the transplant.
So what difference has the transplant made to you over the last 7 years?
The transplant's made a huge difference. As I said, I would have said it's been a transformation over the 7 years in the way that I've been able to live my life in all aspects, both in, as I said, family life, social life, friends, also the way that it's affected all of them, because previous to that transplant I think everybody was quite worried about whether I was going to be unconscious or not. Now they're quite happy. I've been able to drive again after the transplant, so I got my licence back. In actual fact, there are too numerous things to even mention. I couldn't really have wished for any better outcome than receiving. I just feel very fortunate and very lucky to have been given the chance to have had this treatment. My only hope is that others can share in this, and it can be worked on where in the future maybe the immune suppression doesn't need to be given to make things even better. But yes, it's made a huge difference, and I would definitely go through it again if I had to. Highly recommend it.